Today, I'm thrilled to be talking with Pamela Ryckman, an Emmy-winning producer, writer, and business executive focused on women in the workforce. She's the author of the Stiletto Network and has written for the New York Times, Financial Times, and Washington Post, among other publications. Pamela has been featured widely in the press. She's appeared on The Today Show, Rock Center with Brian Williams, Bloomberg TV, and MSNBC, where she's a contributor, and in publications such as the Chicago Tribune, New York Post, Forbes, and Bloomberg. Before becoming a journalist, Pamela worked in finance. She earned her undergraduate degree in comparative literature from Princeton University and her master's in journalism from NYU. In this episode, I'm talking to Pam about her latest book, Candace Pert, Genius, Greed, and Madness in the World of Science, and its heroine, scientist, activist, and trailblazer, Candace Pert. And with that, here's Pamela Ryckman. Pam, thank you so much for coming. I'm so happy to see you. For listeners, Pam and I are old friends, and it's just been such a, so exciting to be able to catch up with you and have you here and see you in person.
It's an honor. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, well, glad you could make it this afternoon. Very glad. So we chatted before we got the microphones rolling and talked about sort of what you've been up to. But for listeners, I think before we start talking about your new book and the incredible subject of your book, I kind of think it's important to sort of give us some background about how you got to the subject, what you've been up to. Your background is in both journalism and in business. What led you from there to Candace Pert?
Well, in a lot of ways, I felt primed for this topic. I mean, in some ways, I felt called because my background is not linear and it is unique. And Candace's thinking was not linear and it is unique. I'm not comparing myself to Candace the genius. I'm just saying that there was a lot in my background that was sort of relevant to her story or into telling this story. So this is my third career incarnation.
Pam is very young and very beautiful, so that's very exciting that she has had such a diverse career so far.
Not as young as I once was, but not as old as I'll be.
It's like looking in a mirror, Pam. You and I are same age.
Exactly. So I started, my undergrad degree was in comparative literature, and my first love was always writing, but I took a circuitous path. I ended up working in management consulting and then in finance, and then pivoted to journalism, decided simultaneous to sort of making babies that my true goal was to write, to become a writer. And then after my first book was published, I was approached by movie and TV people. And for the last decade, I have worked in producing and writing both documentary and scripted film. So that's initially how I came to find Candace Pert, because her story was so fascinating to me.
Tell me about so you worked in finance, you're now, a mom, and you're writing for a bunch of different publications. And then in doing that, just sort of a light bulb went off again, kind of reminding you that this is a passion of yours and you want to go back to writing. Did that then lead you to that first book? And tell us about that first book. Was that called Stiletto Network, if I recall?
That's right.
So
I'd written for the Financial Times for their wealth page, and then was writing about entrepreneurship for the New York Times when in 2010 or 2011, I covered an event for the New York Times that brought together 50 of some of the nation's most high-powered women. So 25 women from the East Coast flew west to Silicon Valley to meet and learn from their entrepreneurial counterparts. And the controversial thesis of this article was that basically Valley girls do it better, that the unique entrepreneurial
California girls.
California girls.
This. Katy Perry knows this. We know this.
That's right. The unique entrepreneurial ecosystem of particularly Silicon Valley allows women and minorities to move more quickly in their careers and take more risks. And so at that event, I met all of these women and I started to discern a trend. I started discovering groups mostly of no more than 10 women, dinner groups, in all industries and in all age groups. I found them in every major American city and globally too. And I followed the money. I found that women from their 20s to their 80s were doing the same thing at the same moment in history. And there was a huge rolling thunder. I charted billions of dollars of transactions, corporate board seats attained, and companies founded and funded, all as a result of these genuine female friendships, all as a result of just these groups of 10. And when you sort of look at the massive Venn diagram and put these all together, this was pre-Me Too. I never could have seen where the world was going. But the thesis of Stiletto Network, that book, was that in the next decade, we were going to see an explosion of female wealth and power.
That is so fascinating. So take me back. So who organized that summit? You were reporting for the New York Times, but who came up with the idea? Was the idea or the premise of it women trying to get women together with other women from both coasts in different industries?
Yes.
You mentioned the 10 women at the table. Were women kind of organized there based on what they were working on, or who put it together? And
so it was organized by Janet Hansen, who was the founder. She was a Goldman alum, and I had worked at Goldman Sachs back in the day. And after she left Goldman, she had founded a group called 85 Broads, which was very funny. Because Goldman's initial address was 85 Broad Street, and it was all for female alums of Goldman. Now that's now turned into Sally Krawcheck took it over a number of years ago, and it's now called Elevate. And it's a much more broad women's network and women's support network, and with financial literacy and all types of interesting things. But where it started was with Janet Hansen getting female alums of Goldman together. She met another woman, Deborah Perry-Piccioni, who had moved. She had started her career on the East Coast in Washington, D.C. She had worked in media and moved to Silicon Valley and had this light bulb moment. She was like, gosh, women are so different here. Again, they take more risks in their careers. They're so much more empowered. What is in the water? What's their secret? And it started with these two women. I had interviewed Deborah for a separate article in the Times, and she told me about this. And it was and interestingly, I was at an interesting part of my life. I just had my third son. I'd just finished nursing. I was exhausted. I was sort of looking for, they say that research is me search.
Right. I was going to say, you're looking for some kind of inspiration to get out of.
I was exhausted. I was like, this is so much harder than I thought it was going to be. And to see these women who were doing just really exciting work in the world inspired me, and I wanted to report on them, but I also wanted to know the secrets.
Right.
And so that article came out in I think November 2012 or 2010 or something, and there I met women who started talking about their dinner. That was a group of 50 women, but I met a lot of them. I'd stayed in touch with them. I'd interviewed them in advance of the article and then afterward, and suddenly, by the time that event took place, 6 months after I started my reporting, it was clear I had 100 pages of single-space notes.
Wow.
And it was clear I hadn't even been planning to write a book, but I joked around that, I had another baby and this one was a girl.
Yeah. Amazing. Which, being the mother of 3 sons, it's exciting that you had your fourth child was a girl. Tell me, so did you ever discern what was in the water? You were talking about, women on the West Coast taking more risks, and did you have one factor that you attributed that to, or how did you?
So Stiletto Network tells it actually uses an individual woman's story. Almost every chapter uses sort of an individual woman's story as a lead in to sort of what her group has done and the impact that each group is making. And then it sort of also brings in economic history, women's history, sociology. It's deep research from all areas of life. But essentially, I wanted to make it really concrete. And then at the end of that book, I actually have 11 tips, because the idea was not just to tell the world that women were doing something interesting, but actually to catalyze a movement, to basically say, okay, here's what these women were doing. They weren't all high powered when they started these groups. These groups are actually the key to their success. By rallying together and sort of following this formula, you can change your life too. And so I ended up doing a ton of speaking engagements to sort of all types of corporate and women's groups to teach them what I'd learned.
So that's so interesting to me, because I'm sure you've heard as a woman and a professional that sometimes women are sort of the worst enemies of women. Did you encounter that? What was different about this group? And was that part 100%. Of the self-selecting or the process of who Jane Hansen kind of brought together. Was that intentional on her part, or did you find that too when you were doing this research?
So interestingly, I was telling everybody that Stiletto Network, I was sort of billing it as a love story disguised as a business story. Obviously these were tips and tricks that you could use to sort of get ahead in your career. And yet at the same time, these groups were rooted in real love, in deep female friendship, and the desire to see not only yourself succeed, but also to be massive advocates for other women in the world and mentors. And, a number of the groups were sort of cross-generational and cross-industry. They were actually built very differently from men's networks, which tend to be very silo-based. Like if you're a male banker, and you're in the aviation group or something, well, then you know your clients and you know other dudes who are bankers. And what I found was, so there were two things happening simultaneously to answer your question. One, I was coming out with this love story, and I had actually had wonderful experiences with women up to that point in my career. But I had heard all the rumors, that the backstabbing, horrible, sharp-elbowed bitch, I'll never work for a woman again. I'd heard these. And so I tried to figure out, okay, I don't think that one group of people of any sort is necessarily good or bad. I look for the systemic reasons that actually sort of encourage different behaviors. And what I found was the fact that these groups were cross-industry and those stereotypes, well, these 2 points were inextricably linked. Historically, and this will get to Candace's story too, and this sort of also primed me, all of this sort of background in women's professional research primed me for Candace. What I found was that if you go back, in many industries, in all industries, but even now today in certain stalwart industries, take banking or law, for instance, you know what it's like. There was really only room for one woman at the top of any particular department, if not company or an entire industry. And so, when there's only room for, like the guys, they were all going to make partner together, so they have an incentive to actually, it's I scratch your back, you scratch mine. We're all on the golf course together. You have to build those relationships with your peers. But when there's only room for one, the systems were pitting women against each other and minorities. You can't shine a light on that talented up-and-comer if she is inevitably going to knock you off your perch. And you can't share information and resources with the woman in the office next to you if, one of you is going to get pushed out. It became this sort of scarcity mentality.
That's really interesting. If it is like the Hunger Games, right, where there's only one person 100%. Who's going to survive, it changes the dynamic of the relationship.
It does entirely. And so what I found was that what actually began as a negative, which is the fact that women had to look outside of their immediate ecosystem to find counterparts, to find other women who understood both their professional and personal issues, actually evolved to be a real positive. Because these groups that I was finding, many of them were cross-industry at a point in time in our society when so much innovation is taking place at the junctions of industries. So, having a silo-based network is actually a detriment, but having people you can draw on who know how things are done in all different industries is actually a huge benefit. And so part of the thesis that in the next decade we were going to see an explosion of female wealth and power was based on the fact that women were drawing from a much broader and deeper knowledge base than their male counterparts.
And that's what you found was working about that particular summit, that group together, was you saw sort of women networking, building relationships across different professional fields. When you talked about those groups of 10, so there would be a mix of different backgrounds within those groups of 10. And because of that structure, you didn't have that situation where there was the feeling of being competitive. It was more, how can we be supportive, and where there are synergies, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Particularly in Silicon Valley, I would say, where, and Hollywood is like this too. As opposed to working, clinging white-knuckled to your patch of power at Goldman Sachs and, and fighting your way up the ladder when you're just in one organization. When you have industries or, that are largely project-based, so much of your network depends on your reputation, your ability to sort of move in and out of different groups. And I think this startup culture, that happens a lot more. Companies come together and disband. In Hollywood, productions come together and disband. So I think that there is an incentive to sort of build relationships, more broadly, and also behave yourself, a little more nicely sometimes. If actually, because you're going to be singing for your supper when you go find your next project.
That's so interesting. And do you think, in your experience or what you've observed since you've written the Stiletto Network in other industries, let's take banking or law, where there maybe is a more, or even working for a corporation where there's more of a hierarchy or a certain linear path. Do you think now that it's not just the one woman or the one, person of color, or the one that they're looking, which would be 20 years ago, it's that there's less of that competitive nature because there's more spots, there's more opportunity?
100%. And part of it is I wanted to prove that. So Stiletto Network, I tell everybody that Stiletto Network, that my life is a testament to the power of Stiletto Network, that I am now doing work that I never expected to do. And inadvertently, I could never have started the process of Stiletto Network trying to sort of capitalize on other women's careers. But what ended up happening was I felt the power of that story because I didn't think I was going to write a book. And then I didn't think that book would be optioned. And then I didn't think that I would be then, working with senior executives in Hollywood and on the writing team. And then
tell us about that.
Yeah.
So you've written Stiletto Network, and now it sounds like also when you were there, you developed your own relationships and connections and met people there, and then started kind of going through this creative process of what's next for you coming out of that book. And so what happened? How do we end up in Hollywood? I know we have an Emmy, on our shelf now, which I can't wait to talk about, but tell us about kind of what happened from there.
I did. And so I think a lot of the stories in Stiletto Network show women at pivotal points in their lives. And I think when I started that process, in more than a decade ago now, I had 3 young children and some very big dreams, and I really did not know how to achieve them. It was a lot harder to be a mom and, in the workforce. And again, I didn't blame anybody outside. I really wanted to be an involved mom. I really also wanted to live my dreams.
Yeah.
And I knew that there was I felt pulled every day. The days I felt like I was doing a great job as a mom, I felt like I was doing a terrible job at work, and vice versa. And I know that that's a common narrative, but people weren't as vocal about it, 10, 15, 20 years ago when we first had our kids. You were supposed to, at least in the industries I was working in, you were supposed to sort of, have a front, you know?
100%.
And so I was having all of these feelings and not really knowing what to do with them. And so, again, Stiletto Network, I found women who were extraordinarily vulnerable with me and told me the stories of the pivotal points in their life, their stories of transition, birth, death, divorce, elder care, the moments where they felt weak and scared, and all of these other women rallied around them and sometimes knew better than they did what was good for them. You know what? You are meant to be an entrepreneur. Get out of that big job. They walked them to the wood. They walked their friends to the woodshed and gave them the courage to do the things that they didn't even know they could do. And in some ways, that's how these groups were so successful. And then they would amplify their achievements. They would amplify their success. So, we as women are taught not to brag and not to but if you have, your team of people, your cheering section out in the world across these different industries, blaring your success and making sure that you're chosen to speak on that panel or that your resume gets to the top of the pile, they were creating opportunities where opportunities did not previously exist. And I will say that I was absolutely the recipient of that. I worked really damn hard for it, but I met an incredible group of people who are now, many of whom are my very dear friends and who have helped me in every area of life. And it also was an incredible lesson to me because I always thought this way, but I didn't necessarily go out of my way to help other people and think about all the different people I could connect them to. And now it's like second nature. And it's good karma, it's good karma and good business to help people you care about.
Oh, 100%. So did any of these women that you met there and that you were researching for your book, did they take you out to the woodshed and said, Pam, you have to develop this into a show, or you have to take this concept and move forward with it in different directions beyond just the book?
Yeah. I mean, they were, many of them became my personal board of advisors. You know what I mean? It was, if they weren't necessarily pushing me to make it a show, they were thinking about, okay, how can you monetize this? Make it a company, make it, get a consultant. I'll give you an example, actually. And this goes back to your initial question about women in the workforce and whether there's more room for one. So after Stiletto Network came out, I'd spoken a number of times at Credit Suisse to various female audiences. I had some senior sponsorship there when the bank still existed.
Yeah.
And I was pulled into the office of the CMO, who was also the head of talent, Pamela Graham, who's amazing. She was Harvard Law, Harvard Business, first Black woman partner at McKinsey, president of CNBC. I mean, she is just an incredible force. And she said she wanted me to be on an advisory board that she was building, that she was, along with the head of private wealth, she was creating a group that it was called the New Markets Initiative, that targeted women, African American, and LGBTQ plus investors. And she wanted me to be on the Women's Advisory Board. And Pat Mitchell of the head of the Paley Center was there, Ann Veneman, the former Treasury Secretary. There were already a couple really high level impressive women on that board. And I was kind of like, well, this is very exciting, And my friend Claudia Batten, and I will kiss her for this, who I met through Stiletto Network, was like, are you kidding me? That's BS. Do you think Malcolm Gladwell gets asked to get on an advisory board and give away all of his knowledge that he's worked on for 4 years for $30,000? That's crap. Get paid for your knowledge. These people are experts in their field, but you are an expert in all of this. You could build this whole program for her. Go back and have that conversation. And I did. And I ended up on retainer working for the CMO of Credit Suisse for a couple of years, and then building programs with her and Tina Brown to Women of Impact. Then I brought her Shaquille O'Neal. We did a separate event for, it was called the Black Men's Leadership Retreat, in the wake of the first Black Lives Matter. It expanded my purview of what I was doing and what I thought I could do tremendously. And that's just one example.
So part of that is just thinking, you mentioned earlier, women as part of our upbringing, maybe not always advocating for ourselves, or I think you said bragging about ourselves or bragging about our accomplishments. I've also, I don't know where I saw this, but, sometimes when we communicate, we'll put in writing, like, so sorry to bother you, but, right? And I'm working hard, like, thank you for your patience as an alternative to that. But it speaks to that, you were so excited to be a part of this advisory board, and how great that this friend of yours, mentor of yours said, wait a second, what about this? And you noticed that when you asked, you were able to do that and put that together, and they were thrilled to have you.
What she said was, do you want a job? Do you want a full-time job, or do you want a consulting engagement? I said a consulting engagement, because I already had the TV show sort of in the works at that point. And she's like, okay.
Okay, well, tell me about that. Tell me about the TV show.
But I'll tell you one more thing about the Credit Suisse thing at that point. Because at that point, I knew that the Queen Bee myth was not true. I knew that women were not just backstabbing each other. I knew that there was a systemic problem in corporate America. And I, because of my Credit Suisse work, sat next to Stefano Natella, who is the head of research, one night at a dinner party. And he's like, okay, women's stuff, what should I be looking at? And I said, well, we should overturn the Queen Bee myth. And so I ended up working with the head of research at Credit Suisse on a separate consulting engagement where we looked at the 3,000 public companies. And we looked at women not just at the top, but also the numbers of women they had in different levels of management. And what we discerned was that the more, it's what people think. The more women you have, the more they hire women, the more they pay women, the more they support women. It is really like when they talk about, on corporate boards, how to shift the dynamic, you need 3. And so you don't need one woman, because that's not enough to convince everybody else. And she's always going to be in a defensive position. You need 3, and then everything changes. And it's the same thing in corporate
including
groups.
More work getting done.
More work, yeah. Well, and also, all the studies show that with greater diversity comes better outcomes financially.
Right.
Because people have blind spots. And if you're only thinking in one way, then you're going to miss things.
What an impact Pam.
It changed my whole life.
No, but
I'm so grateful.
The fact that you did that research and bringing that to Credit Suisse, and I'm sure there was a ripple effect of that. You
actually, Melinda
at that.
Gates and Sheryl Sandberg showed it. Were trotting it out at various events. It was an honor and exciting.
Oh, it's so exciting! Really, really important. And then so simultaneously, you're doing that work, and you just sort of casually dropped in the TV show. But I mean, you do have 3 children. She does sleep. I don't know how many hours a night, but not enough.
I don't look very good right now.
You do. You must be like one of those people that can survive on 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. But so tell us, is the TV show coming out of the Stiletto Network? Is this happening? You've got...
So that is now one of sort of a suite of projects that I'm working on. Initially it didn't go because, again, mandates changed. It was an incredible learning experience, I have to say. And it also tapped into, I'll say this again, that experience, I did not, you think you have a plan for your life and it just, something happens, another door opens. And if Stiletto Network and that whole experience gave me the courage to walk through it. So after Stiletto Network was published, I was approached by a number of producers, most of whom were not that impressive, and some of whom wanted to Real Housewives it up, like Stiletto Network. That's a title I can sell, but I just saw this becoming a disaster. But then after being in a lot of the wrong rooms and really learning a lot about how Hollywood works, I ended up in a number of the right rooms. And so I was working with a tremendous group of partners on that. It fell apart in COVID, not
As
surprisingly.
Many things did, yeah.
And the mandates changed. So it's not dead yet. But what that process taught me is, I was not necessarily planning to pivot away from journalism at that point. But writing a book made me realize how much I loved writing in my own voice and being more creative. And I'd also been a theater geek for my whole life. I'd been producing theater. I'd been on theater boards. I wrote my senior thesis in college on French theater. This was core to my being. And I had been squirreling away material for 20 years thinking I was going to write plays someday. And one of these producers said, "Hey, you're really good with dialogue. Have you ever thought about writing for movies and TV?" And I was like, oh my God, that's my secret dream. And it was the kind of thing where I didn't even know to dream that.
But you sort of had that in you, right?
Yeah. I had hundreds of pages of material thinking when was I going to do this? And then suddenly I did, so I've sort of spent the last decade both writing. I hired a coach and stuff to help me because there's art and then there's also sort of science to this. And I've talked to everybody I could talk to in the industry. And I just love this work so much. I want to do it till I'm dead. I just love it. It's it's so great to, again, at any age, I'm 49 and I just feel like the world is just beginning. And I love that feeling.
Oh, it's so great. Tell me you kind of would be working as a screenwriter for Stiletto Network or a writer, producer, if that were, as that was being developed. But then you won an Emmy last year. Tell me about that. Was that for writing? Was that for production? And how did that come about?
As a producer. So when I was bringing my writing to other producers, the feedback I got from a number of people was really valuable. They said, yeah, you know what? Your writing is great, but this industry is really hard to break into. You don't just show up and say, oh, I'm leading a writer's room or whatever, and I understood that. And so they said, why are you coming out? I mean, as we've seen in the writer strike, unfortunately, writers are sometimes treated like the hired help in Hollywood. They don't really have... hopefully writers have more power now, but historically very little. And so unless you are, David E. Kelley, right? I mean, there are some exclusive writers, but for the most part, writers can get screwed fairly easily. And so the feedback I got from producers is, why aren't you coming out with your producer hat on? You've produced theater before. You have, business background. Sort of, I spent my first, 8 years of my career in management consulting and finance. So what I did was I hired a line producer. I had him, build up a budget. I had him teach me exactly what goes in every single line item. I learned, and I had a basis for learning. So I did come out as a producer. And so part of what I've been doing, and also this is sort of how I came to find Candace Pert. I've been not only writing my own scripts and coming up with treatments for shows on my own, but also looking to produce other people's work. And so the Emmy was, I got back in touch with Cynthia Wade, who is an Oscar-winning director who I met through Stiletto Network, through somebody. She won an Oscar for Freeheld, her documentary short. She was nominated for Mondays at Racine. And I had an idea for a documentary that I was sort of pitching her based on Candace, interestingly. And she said, well, I've got this other thing going on right now. Maybe you want to hear about it. And her story was called The Flag Makers. It was so deeply, deeply moving to me. This was during COVID. She found the largest flag making company in the United States, and it's based in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, right near where Jacob Blake was shot, and is almost entirely staffed by immigrants and refugees. So it's not a political piece. It doesn't hit you over the head. It is this beautiful meditation on the American dream.
Wow.
And she was doing this at a time, I'm going to cry, where our country was so deeply divided. And you saw a refugee from Rwanda sitting next to someone who, escaped the Gulf War, sitting next to a Mexican American whose son was fighting for our country, and yet she's being discriminated against. Yeah. And you saw, and then Barbara, who's, a card-carrying Trump supporter, but doesn't see the dissonance that all of these people she loves, who she works with, under his, regime, are being discriminated against. And it is this beautiful story about why people come to this country and what makes our country great. And Cynthia, what she wanted to do actually was, oh my God, the final shoot, we had Ellis Island to ourselves at 6 a.m. It was so beautiful because Raditza, one of the, the managers, with a senior manager there, had never been to New York. She'd never seen the Statue of Liberty, where the Eater flags fly. And we got to all witness that moment. It was so it's Nat Geo, but it's also on Hulu and Disney Plus.
Oh, amazing.
And I mean, it was like, so when I was an executive producer and, getting an Emmy was just, we could have won no awards, and I just would have been the most proud person of Cynthia and that whole project. I just think it was so beautiful.
Story. We have a friend who became a citizen, maybe Emmeline was a baby and we took her. So 16 years ago, and we went to Brooklyn, and I can't recall if it was I think it was a courtroom, but everybody was being sworn in as American citizens, and every person was different in the room, and the pride and joy of the people there. And by the way, they all, study to take their exam, then they pass their exam, and then they
know more about this country than we do.
I know. It's a really, moving and poignant, moment and process, and something I feel like most American, because I think people we all sort of take our freedom here for granted sometimes, and watching people come from other countries with such pride and excitement about becoming American is really something to see. Okay, so you, by the way, what a great subject, and I can't wait to see it.
The Flag Makers, everybody watch it.
But while you're the executive producer of that project, you're obviously writing this book about Candace Pert. I love the title, Candace Pert, Genius, Greed, and Madness, right? Mm-hmm. Tell me, how did you come to discover Candace, and what was that?
So this is interesting process too. And again, so much of this is organic, right? I mean, how do you find a story? How does somebody appeal to you? I read Candace's 1997 memoir, which was called Molecules of Emotion. It was recommended to me by my writing coach because I was working on another script. And she said, maybe you want to make this character a scientist or something, like maybe you need to add some gravitas or something. And she knew that I was sort of into mind-body stuff, that I had sort of just in my personal life, I sort of, follow all the biohackers and read about peak performance. And because I also want to, I want to age well, and I want to
say, now that we found our passion at 49, you want to,
right. It's like, I want to do it till I know I want to do this for another 50 years. So I want to be capable and switched on. And so she knew that I was into this stuff, and she's like, well, this is actually, read this woman's story because you'll find it interesting both personally and professionally. So I read Molecules of Emotion. This is like in 2015. And I was like, holy cow, this is not research for another story. This is the main event. I learned that Candace discovered the opioid receptor in 1972 as a 26-year-old grad student, right? I mean, I learned that Candace was the mother of the mind-body revolution. I knew that Candace, I learned that Candace developed Peptide T, which is the underground AIDS drug featured in Dallas Buyers Club. I mean, she was like this Forrest Gump figure in history. Like, she played major roles in huge movements, not only in American history, but global history. And I was like, I want to produce this. This is her.
Right. And why is she not
why doesn't anybody know
name?
about her?
Yeah.
Right. And so I approached her. She died in 2013. And, I read her book maybe 18 months later. And I was like, oh, gosh. And then suddenly I started to hear her name actually on some of these, on Dave Asprey's, Bulletproof podcast and stuff. Deepak Chopra credits Candace with forming the scientific basis, what became his career, the mind-body connection. And so I suddenly it's like when you learn a new word, it's like you see it everywhere. I was like, oh my gosh, she exists out in the world. So I approached her widower, who had the rights to her book, wearing my producer hat with the intention to make a film about her life, a biopic. However, because her book was published in 1997 and she died in 2013, I also signed a separate agreement with him called the Life Story and Consulting Agreement, wherein he agreed to open his Rolodex, give me, sit for interviews, introduce me to other people, her other family members, give me archival materials, everything that I would need to find basically the last 30 pages of the script. How did her story end? And
wait, so I just want to interrupt you there for a second. So you approached him and you would buy the rights because you were thinking of writing a screenplay about her
Correct.
At that time. Okay. Based on Molecules of Emotion. And
exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And that was my initial intention. But what I found was so shocking to me in so many ways that it then became clear that I was working on another book. This wasn't just a screenplay. This was, Candace's personal story is an incredible launchpad to discuss much wider issues within the American medical establishment and with regard to sort of women in particular.
Okay, well, let's do that because in preparation for today, we talked about, you were saying that her name was popping up everywhere after you learned about her from reading her book. And then is that the same thing happened with me? I mean, I was sort of thinking like, who is Candace Pert? And then and it's fascinating what her contributions were to both to science and to sort of women's role within the scientific community. So she's a graduate student, right? Mm-hmm. Johns Hopkins in the 1970s. And that is where she starts doing her research, I think, on, now the first thing was her discovering the opioid receptor. Do you want to talk about, because you think about all the medications and drugs that have come out of that, and here she is. How did she make that discovery and what happened after she made it?
Yeah. Part of what I say is that Candace is like Pandora, who opened the box, and then also Cassandra, who ended up warning everyone about the misuse of her, of her what discovery, her intentions. Yeah. So this is actually, there's some really interesting history here that I discovered that I did not know at all before. Most people think that the opioid crisis started in the 1990s, but in fact, it started in the early 70s with Richard Nixon declaring war on drugs. So Richard Nixon wanted to escalate bombing in Vietnam, and he was dealing with an at-home population that disagreed with his policies. And essentially what was happening was there was a massive heroin addiction both at home and abroad. 25% of soldiers fighting in Vietnam were addicted to a form of heroin that was 95% pure. The street heroin that you could get in the U.S. was 5% pure. So you had these absolutely drug-addled soldiers being blamed for, executing things like the My Lai massacre, right? And drugs were basically being blamed for. Our soldiers, absolutely horrific, like gang rape and mass slaughter of children and women abroad. And so this was bad PR for Nixon, essentially. Then, meanwhile, at home, you had reports of heroin addiction, basically the flower children who would, this is where the term gateway drugs started being used, had escalated from marijuana or, to other things, to heroin, essentially. So you had, the press was riddled in the early 70s of, white, God forbid, right? White teenagers dying of heroin overdose, right? So again, Nixon has a huge PR problem. What does he do to get the American population on his side? He declares a war on drugs. And he poured an unprecedented amount of money, like the drug czar, into scientific research to figure out how to cure heroin addiction. To addiction, right? And so what does that mean? What had previously been what was called the Opiate Club, which is a very small group of scientists globally sort of studying addiction. It wasn't an area that anyone cared about at all. Suddenly, you put money and political influence and power into that, and everybody comes running. Everybody wants a piece of that pie for a grant, right? Because they also see it as a stepping stone to, press for them, the Nobel Prize, perhaps, right? Because the spotlight is on this. People are watching now. And so what ended up happening was—
That is so interesting, thinking about how government can influence scientific research and kind of turn that into a different direction if they're, because of the access to funds and attention that you're talking about.
100%. And when we get to AIDS later, it was the same thing. Reagan ignored it until he didn't. And then science ignored it until they didn't. I mean, it was the exact same process all over again, 15 years later. And Candace was at the center of both of those. So Candace is this young graduate student, right, who had gotten accidentally pregnant at age 19, with her. I mean, wow. Candace was a firebrand. She was wild in every area of life. She was definitely, to say that she marched to the beat of her own drum is an understatement. I mean, at her husband Agu's, he was doing, to fulfill his military duty, he was working at Edgewood Arsenal, and his boss was like this Southern colonel. And to the holiday party, the Christmas party, Candace brought, anatomically correct gingerbread cookies. She would sunbathe in the nude, like when all the other women were wearing, beehive helmets and pillbox hats. She was like wild and free, didn't shave her legs, didn't shave her armpits. She didn't wear a bra. I mean, she was like one of the original, just sort of absolute, like wild women hippies, so it made her so fun to research and live with too. I mean, I even, and we can talk about this later, but she ended up doing some pretty rough things and bad things in her later life, but I love her, and I've loved living with her for the last 6 years. So the bottom line is Candace is this woman with like unlimited amounts of chutzpah,
and so it's the 70s. Nixon has now allocated attention and funds to this research. And then did she decide that she was going to start pursuing or was she already working on it? She was
in a grad program at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, working for this wunderkind, Saul Snyder, who was the youngest tenured professor at, there at the time. And she had been assigned for her dissertation a pretty boring assay because she was kind of sloppy and she was kind of wild, right? And she decided, no, what I want to do is I want to do something that actually has real world impact. I'm going to try to find the opiate receptor, in part because she had a personal experience. Again, research is me search. She had fallen with Agu. He had some sort of training at a MASH unit in the summer of 1970. And before she started grad school, she was taking riding lessons and fell from her horse and fractured her vertebrae. So she ended up in what started this, her fascination with opiates was personal because she was in a hospital, like laid up for 3 weeks, being given Demerol. And she was surrounded by soldiers from Vietnam who were all being given opioids, and they were all hopped up. And she realized, she was like, oh my gosh, like she did not— when I say in the book is she wasn't addicted, but she became addicted to the concept of drug addiction because she realized how powerful it made her.
Right.
It made her feel blissful. And then she actually thought about stealing some on her way out. And she said, she was thinking about like, this is also like the romantic story of opioids as told by poets throughout time. She was like, I want to know the biochemical mechanism by which this works in the human body.
Yep.
So after 6 months of trying, so Saul says yes, her mentor and her boss says yes. And after 6 months of trying, she's not getting anywhere. And he's like, okay, you know what? Enough. My job as your, lab chief is to make sure that you actually get a dissertation. This isn't going anywhere. There's, the competition is fierce. It's worldwide. We're going to put you back on your other essay. She decides, she had a lightning bulb moment, because she had also been working with her husband, Agu, who was also a scientist, had been working at Edgewood Arsenal with naloxone, which is a known, it's called an antagonist. It's something that if you deliver it, and they didn't know how this worked, but they just knew that it did work, that if you actually give naloxone to someone who's having a heroin overdose, that person will come out of it. It'll save a life.
Is that Narcan? Is it in the Narcan kits or?
I don't know. I'm not sure about I don't know. I'm not sure. But she knew that naloxone worked. And so she ended up taking some from Agu's lab behind Saul's back. He went to a conference. This is the type of person she was. She took it behind Saul's back. She sent it to New England nuclear facility to have it made radioactive behind his back. Somehow, I think she must have forged a signature or something like that. She got it. She hid the materials after being told to
Why did she want to make it radioactive?
Because that's actually it's what the experiment requires.
Oh, I see. To see how it would.
It's like sort of like, it's called a trace, figuring out the way to the bullseye. And she figured maybe naloxone was a more powerful way to find it rather than. We don't need to get into all I go into it in the book, sort of the details of the experiment, but for lay listeners, lay readers, basically, so she did something that was, questionable, if not illegal. She waited till Friday night until all of her colleagues went home. And it's a crazy story. Her son, Evan, she got a call from Agu. Evan, the babysitter was sick. Evan had to be picked up by, at his daycare. So she makes this calculation. She's like, okay, I can run, I could pick up Evan, I could be back to the lab in an hour. Okay, what about the lab's prohibition against children with radioactive materials? Whatever. She took a flyer on it, So she shows up with her 4-year-old son in the lab, gives him a bunch of test tubes to play with or something, and does this experiment, then waits on pins and needles until Monday. And lo and behold, she's figured out, she finds the opiate receptor. She does what scientists the world over are doing. And in so doing, she thinks that she's found the first step in eradicating addiction. She thinks she's going to help people all over the world. And she never could have imagined the nightmare she set in motion.
So what happens after that? So she makes this discovery. I don't know. Yeah. She writes a paper about this. She talks to her. I don't know who she had to apologize to for stealing.
Nobody cared. Nobody found it. You know what I mean? All sins were forgiven. Yeah, it's ask for forgiveness, not for permission.
Exactly.
It's
And then, so her thought is now that she understands where that receptor is, you can figure out how to block it so that any drug that would try to connect to it and get that high would be blocked.
Exactly.
But what happened instead?
So she, interestingly, she not only discovered the opiate receptor, she pioneered the technique that labs and all pharmaceutical companies still use today to test the drug efficacy and figure out dosage. The technique that she used was then deployed in her lab by everyone in the lab. She taught everyone, or, Saul basically spread her knowledge around to find every other receptor. The, cannabis receptor, the nicotine receptor. What has enabled the drug revolution? All SSRIs, Viagra, not only relates back to her initial finding and her technique. Because a receptor is, just to sort of give a little, I'm not a scientist, so this was fascinating for me. Candace was doing revolutionary interdisciplinary work. So at a time when most scientists never looked beyond the confines of their silos. So I had to talk to really understand her work. I had to talk to people who were, neuropsychopharmacologists, neurologists, immunologists, virologists. She was doing work that sort of was really crossed the boundaries into all these different fields. And essentially a receptor is a little part that floats on the surface of a cell. And we have neurochemicals that fit into those receptors, kind of like a lock and a key. It's not a totally apt analogy because they kind of vibrate together and almost like sing. But so when one of the things that she realized is that, and put forth was, okay, our receptors did not evolve. They didn't develop to just for exogenous drugs, for external drugs. We have to have our own internal chemical that's meant to fit into that receptor and set off a series of chemical reactions that hopefully benefits our body, right?
Which makes sense, right? Because why else would our body have it if there wasn't something else that we need, that was part of our normal function? Right.
As a result of Candace's, when she found the receptor, then suddenly within 3 years, two scientists, Hans Kosterlitz and John Hughes at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, discovered the reason for that receptor, endorphins. Endorphins means endogenous morphine, our body's internal high.
Okay.
And so this is sort of a key part of the story, because big pharmaceutical companies initially moved to develop drug treatments based on endorphins. They wanted to create a mimetic so that we could find some sort of something, like we could have a drug that would fit into that receptor and block the receptor so that, to stop people from becoming addicted, and to stop overdoses. They proved unable to do that. And the minute they proved unable to do that, they thought about, how else can we make money here? And they started making much more potent analgesics. And that's what led to the opioid crisis.
Fascinating. But I'm curious, when you talked about her, she taught everybody in her lab about her process. Was that known at the time that she was the person who had discovered that, I guess, technology? I mean, was she given credit for that? Or was it just something that was just adopted by others, taken from her, and then other researchers and companies ran with it?
That is a great question, because it actually speaks to so much, to a much larger issue in both academia and in the government. When you make a big discovery at either an academic institution or at a government agency like the NIH, you are using their government labs. You are an employee. So your employer owns that technology. Your employer has the patent. What employers will do, and this is a huge issue right now with Katalin Karikó, who just won the Nobel Prize for her research in mRNA research, her in mRNA that led to the COVID vaccine, who was basically treated like a piece of garbage by the University of Pennsylvania. She and her partner, Drew Weissman, tried to get the patent. They tried to get the license.
Right.
So Penn owns the patent, or Johns Hopkins.
I was going to
owns
ask,
the patent,
John Hopkins owns the patent for Pert's research. Process.
So then you have to, what institutions will do, they will allow you to license the patent. If you show that you have a viable commercial partner, someone who will fund this, you have a path to commercialize, they will give you the ability and sort of like a 7-year lead generally to commercialize whatever technology, with the understanding, and this is actually quite fair, that if you are able to do that, then a certain percentage of those funds goes back to medical research, and so that's a good deal. The problem is not all scientists like Katalin Karikó had the ability, didn't have the funds to actually license her own patent initially. So Penn licensed it to someone else, has gone on to make tens of millions of dollars off of her discovery, and she's never made more than $60,000 a year. She just bought her first car. And so this was that story was being told in the press. The Wall Street Journal did a great story about this, but then the conflict in the Middle East occurred, and it basically drowned that. I mean, it was just lost. But I think there are bigger issues here faced by not only female scientists but men. About sort of, are you able to actually benefit personally from your discoveries? And, some of the issues that are even happening about college sports, I think, are also relevant, because now they've started to pay college athletes and actually give them a stake in things. So what do you deserve as the individual versus how much does the house take? I think is sort of a big issue, and one worth investigating in greater depth.
So take us back to Scotland. So they make this discovery, and then you said, and this is kind of the beginning of the opioid crisis. What happens from there?
So, well, I'll take you even back a couple of years further. So Candace stays. Typically, a graduate student will go and do postdoc work in another institution. But this basically, Candace's discovery revolutionized the entire field of psychopharmacology, and so she stays with her mentor, Saul Snyder, because and to when we were talking about ask for don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. Yeah. Saul forgave her the second she found it because he saw a huge opportunity for himself. He involved her and he let her, speak on this topic, but he also really moved to take credit for this himself. And I think, this is where it becomes like the lines become blurred and gray, because I interviewed many, many people about the ethics of this. And generally, it is not uncommon for lab chiefs to take credit for work that is done by their underlings, because they did provide the guidance. They did provide the resources. You know what I mean? It's like the CEO of a company will take credit. It's not just you are the top, but hopefully you are the leader of your team, right? But what ended up happening was, after allowing Candace to really be a vocal, spokesperson for this, she was quoted in the press. I mean, this discovery received a ton of press and a ton of, actually everyone in the government was trying to take credit for it too, because the NIH...
Because they gave the funding.
Right, exactly. So Nixon was trying to take credit for it. The NIH was then trying to take credit for it because Nixon was trying to take money away from the NIH. So it was really, there was a land grab in terms of power and money and how this discovery would be used. And Candace is this 26-year-old woman at the center of it. She was a newbie. She didn't know. She was thrilled, and having her, she was all over the press. Then when it came for the awards, though, here's where she really got destroyed. Saul Snyder, and he claimed to not have any knowledge of this, but I interviewed people who say otherwise. There was the chief at, his boss basically at Johns Hopkins, put in an application for Saul to win the Lasker Award. He was nominated for the Lasker Award along with the two scientists at the University of Aberdeen who had discovered endorphins. Now, Candace was left out of that entirely. The Lasker Award is America's highest scientific award, and it is often a precursor to the Nobel Prize. And you could say, so the Lasker Award, actually, you could have more than 3 people. Why would Candace have been left off? Well, because only 3 people can win the Nobel Prize in any one area. So this was a strategic attempt to cut out the lowest man on the totem pole, who happened to have been a woman, because nobody thought she would fight back. Because they were positioning themselves. And Saul came from a line of Nobel Prize winners. Candace was in a line of people who were the absolute top in their field. Saul's mentor, Julius Axelrod, had won the Nobel Prize. His mentor, Steve Brody, hadn't won the Nobel Prize, but he had basically was considered the father of pharmacology. And so suddenly, Candace, who's next in line in that lineage, gets cut completely. And instead of, putting her tail between her legs and going back to work, like Katalin Kariko did, by the way, when she was sort of cut out until, this is an older woman who's finally winning the Nobel Prize at the very end of her career after being silent and silenced many times. I mean, her story is profound and echoes Candace's in a lot of ways. Candace she went to the press. And she got female journalists and all these people on her side to show precedent. John Hughes was in the same position on that paper as she was. She deserved to have some credit, but she was cut out in the race for money, power, and the Nobel Prize. And she became the Scarlet Woman of neuroscience.
And when you say that, was that because after that point, did she have a hard time? Was she kind of excommunicated from her lab and research at Johns Hopkins? Was she sort of just people were hesitant to work with her? What happened from there?
Candace was already working at the NIH at that point. Okay. So these processes and these awards take years to sort of play out. So she had discovered the opiate receptor in 1972. The Lasker Award was awarded in 1979. And she found out about, being cut out in 1978. So she was already firmly ensconced in her job at the NIH, which Saul had helped to get her, secure for her and Agu positions at the NIH. So she hadn't yet become, which she went on to become chief of brain biochemistry at the NIH, but she was already working there successfully. So she was working there. And again, Candace was a wild woman, right? She wasn't a linear thinker, as you've seen in her videos. She was really, but she was doing really fruitful, incredible work. And her colleague there, Miles Herkenham, who I interviewed, said she launched like an absolute revolution in neuroscience. She was discovering all of these other receptors, and she was bringing incredible people to her lab. She was a great mentor. But the minute this happened in 1979, she was branded. She was, people stopped wanting to work with her. She was seen as ungrateful. And in part, not only because she was going after her mentor, but because she was exposing the seedy underpinnings and, dirty business that underlies this field that is supposedly governed by reason. She was showing that it's actually political and dirty.
Yeah. Amazing. And was that the focus of the articles that were written? It was sort of about how the process of her being cut out and how the inner workings of whether it's the Lasker Prize or however they're positioning themselves for the Nobel Prize, that was very intentional on their part, kind of cutting out the lower person on the totem pole and who happens to be younger and female.
Some of them. And in some cases, she was also cut out of another prize, and there was an official apology written after. So this was really, what she was doing was, being a whistleblower and causing institutions to look at themselves. But she was doing it by sort of bringing it to the attention of others, which makes everybody look bad. And so that was not appreciated.
So now she's at the NIH. She's not the chief of brain biochemistry at that time, but she's there and she's continuing her work. And was her research there focused also, I guess if she went on to become the chief of brain biochemistry, it was, again, similar work that she was doing when she was at Johns Hopkins. But she then discovers peptide T.
Yeah. Well, before peptide T, even in the early 80s, in like 1981, she started to think about, and this all stemmed from her original receptor work. It was almost like, again, it was iterative and organic. It was sort of like, oh, now I understand how this part of the brain works. She started to find peptides, and she started to wonder, hold on a second. How is it that we keep talking about if there are chemicals that actually fit into receptors in different parts of in both our brain and our body? Then why do we assume that the brain and body don't talk to each other, are totally separate? And again, here what she was doing was paradigm shifting work. She was actually overturning the reigning paradigm that had governed Western medicine for 400 years. And this is another interesting, crazy story.
This is part of her Forrest Gump story.
It is.
Yes,
it is.
Having...
It's like, so in the 1600s, René Descartes, who's the father of modern science and philosophy, wanted to autopsy bodies. He wanted to figure out how our systems worked. But in order to do so, he had to get permission from the Pope, because cutting out dead bodies was, considered a sacrilege. So if he and the Pope could decide that man's inherent sacredness, we're not supposed to say man's these days, sorry, I'm an old lady, humans' inherent sacredness is really from the neck up, right? That our connection to the divine is entirely based in our brain, and that is sort of where where our connection to God resides, then basically everything below is a meat sack, And that's the deal that they made. Of course, that's wrong. And it goes totally counter to what everyone is taught in Eastern medicine, which is that everything is, when you think about chi or prana, there's a life force, right? Candace was saying that Descartes and the Pope were wrong. And all of Western medicine was wrong, because the entire NIH was built on the presumption that the brain and body are totally separate. That each, and this is also why, and the grant structures grants were structured in entirely silo-based, not interdisciplinary ways. You were basically taught, if you're a virologist, you're thinking about how to eradicate the disease, but you're not thinking about what caused it in the first place. And what Candace was saying is that if mind and body are actually linked, then things like, let's think about stress. She was one of the first people saying that stress could cause disease. That our minds influence our bodies and our bodies influence our minds, and they are one. And she actually, through the flow of peptides, again, I mean, we can go deeper into the science, but these chemicals that basically were turning up on immune receptors in our body, but also in our brain. You know, she said if she showed in the early 1980s that this was a fact, she went on to write more than 200 papers about peptides, but it would be decades before she was believed and her work became what is now common knowledge. Like Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, which has spent years on the New York Times bestseller list, he never name checks her. All of his research is based on her work. And he is espousing techniques that Candace was talking about 40 years ago.
What kind of techniques, like meditation or things?
Meditation, yoga, biofeedback, EMDR, eye movement desensitization, you know, like all of this stuff. She was basically saying, and this also spoke to what she was seeing with the opiate receptor. That what she was saying is that, you know, and this is another reason that she was highly controversial. Many of her colleagues at the NIH and from academia were now working hand in glove. And this also goes into the whole political situation. Why? Because Reagan rescinded funding from academic institute, or not rescinded funding. He stopped government funding to academic institutions. So academic institutions around this time were forced to look to pharmaceutical companies to fund their academic research. Well, of course, that causes a conflict of interest. And so a lot of her colleagues were working hand in glove with pharmaceutical companies who did not necessarily put human health first. They put profits first. And she was seeing that this influenced the way that medical research was going, and that many of her medical colleagues were treating patients. So what she was saying is that...
So is that when she realized that she'd opened Pandora's box from discovering... Here she discovers the opioid receptor, right? And then does she talk about, or in what you've read about her, that moment where she recognized that the research that she had discovered was going in the direction that she intended, the opposite direction? Because here she wanted to try to address addiction, right? And now she's seeing it, being used for quite the opposite purpose.
It was a slow process before she realized actually how bad it had gotten. You know, but what she was seeing was that she was realizing that there were all of these natural methods available to us, that our body, you know, she was saying something controversial and something that wasn't going to make herself or her colleagues money, which is that the body and mind have the ability to heal themselves. And there are all of these different things that we can do to reprogram our bodies at a cellular level that are available to us through natural means. But she saw that psychiatrists and psychologists who were treating based on the Cartesian model that mind and body are separate. So you had psychologists and psychiatrists treating the mind with no regard for its effect on the body, and then you had physicians treating the body with no regard for its effect on the mind. But if mind and body are one, then you have to look at the entire system holistically, and you have to treat it holistically. So you have cancer, but why did you get cancer in the first place? Have you been under stress for years? Were you abused as a child? Has your body basically been in a permanent state of fight or flight, you know, firing off cortisol and things that actually cause cancer? Like, she was looking into these ideas at a time when other particularly psychiatrists were trigger happy when it came to prescriptions. Oh, you're sad? Take a pill, fix your life. You're depressed? What she was saying is we need to actually think, and now this philosophy is sort of, you know, entered into common knowledge. But she was saying this 40 years ago. We need to think about the root causes of disease and fix them as the root, not just take a pill, which just forms a Band-Aid, but doesn't actually get at the root cause.
So how is that, when you said she's doing this research and it's not being well received, was she at that time, you know, writing papers, she was speaking, or was she just such a sort of, I think I read this somewhere, sort of like kind of the scarlet letter of the scientific community at the time? And then I know that she had that a lot of her work inspired, for example, Deepak Chopra and the work that he had done later. When did that start to shift for her, that her research and her work, was getting attention from others in a positive way?
So I mean, now if we have the benefit of hindsight, so we can sort of draw the through line into all the different things, like how one led to the next. But really, in the moment, these things happened. They seemed sort of fairly singular, right? I mean, it was, the knowledge of receptors that led her to sort of, peptides fit into these receptors. How do they work? Those receptors exist in the brain and the body, right? But it seemed that she was doing sort of separate work. Now obviously it was all interlinked. After that, she continued to sort of publish mind-body studies, but none of this was really being picked up or respected by the scientific community. It wouldn't be until the 90s that her work started to really infiltrate more. So one of the people I interviewed was Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is one of the top 1% she's a Northeastern professor, 1% most cited scientists in the field, which basically means she is an absolute leader and rock star. And what she said was she went back and looked at molecules of emotion before her interview, and she just said that she was blown away because so many of Candace's findings are now completely baked into the field to the extent that they're not even linked to her name. They're just common knowledge, and they're assumed to be true. But those initial barrier-breaking studies that she did 40 years ago were met with tremendous resistance. She was being laughed out of rooms. She was getting eye rolls reserved for mysticism by saying that René Descartes was wrong, that the basis of the whole NIH and Western medical system was wrong, that our way of treating the brain and the body separately was wrong. She was told that she was crazy. I mean, they couldn't kick her out of the NIH. She was doing enough really interesting work that people kept her around. But fundamentally, she was losing respect because she was boundary breaking.
When did she realize, or at what point did her peptide discovery get sort of directed towards AIDS research? And I know you talked a lot about the connection between government funding and how that kind of, whatever work is being done, whether at academic institutions or maybe even labs that are supporting pharmaceutical companies, that they kind of pivot based on kind of where the funding is coming from. I guess particularly academic institutions, probably more than pharmaceutical companies who have their own funding. But how did that happen? What was that process for saying, okay, wait a minute, this discovery of peptide T, we could actually use this to help fight HIV?
Yeah. So, and again, this is all of Candace's work was tied up with major movements, major political movements, and historical, cultural movements in society. So the AIDS pandemic was basically allowed to rage for 5 to 10 years unabated because of prejudice, because nobody wanted to talk about homosexual sex and how AIDS was, transmitted, because, we had conservative people in our government who were stigmatizing, gay men and blaming them. And basically, and then you had the Jerry Falwells of the world and, basically saying that this was God raining a plague down upon sinners, right? I mean, so the scientists I talked to said that, they weren't just doing medical research. They were fighting all types of, stigmas and resistance at every part of the government, So the Reagan administration, despite saying that it was their number one priority in terms of health, did not allocate any money to, and interestingly, I have some examples in the book of how much money was allocated, how much money and sort of governmental researchers were allocated to figuring out what caused a disease outbreak of like a couple, I can't remember how many, but like tens of veterans, maybe it was 50 or 25 or whatever, Legionnaire's disease. Like immediately the government got on that, deployed resources, threw money at it to figure out that like there had been bacteria in the air system, in the air conditioning of, a hotel where there was a veteran con. It was the same thing when the Tylenol scare happened. 7 people were killed by some rogue who tampered with Tylenol.
Yeah.
And huge press, huge governmental resources. Suddenly, if you look at like the just dollar amounts, it was like an AIDS patient, someone with AIDS was worth like a quarter of a human being. You know how like they used to measure like slaves were 3/4 of a man. This was like people with AIDS were not interesting to the government at all.
So, and that was just, then there became a shift, a societal shift of people focusing.
Finally, basically Reagan was shamed into, there were enough, the advocates and groups like ACT UP became increasingly powerful.
And I remember there being a big shift when Magic Johnson, became public, that people who were prejudiced, and had other, ideas about it, I think began to realize that it's a broader 100% health crisis.
And I mean, there were news programs and stuff. I talked to, Dr. Jeff Galpin, who was, an incredible researcher, was featured finally on, on a show that, showed that someone had gotten it through a blood transfusion. Right. Someone had gotten a child being born to a mother who had, that it was an
Which,
equal
by the way,
opportunity.
is so shocking that was even, that it had to be kind of justified as it being something that could be an accident, as opposed to just the fact that this was a disease that was spread however it was spread, but it's
completely. I mean,
killing people.
The stigma was intense. So Candace was suddenly, though, Reagan gets interested. It's the same process, right? He's shamed, finally throw some money at it, right? Then it's like sharks to the scrum, right? So all the scientists who were not interested and didn't care before, and really don't care about AIDS patients at all, but they come running because what's at stake? Money, power, the Nobel Prize, right? So there's a lot more interest once the money is infused, right? You have Bob Gallo, who's a very senior guy at the National Cancer Institute. He wants to stake a claim. You have Tony Fauci, who is the youngest leader of an institute at the National Institutes of Health. He led the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Disease. He wants to stake a claim. Everybody's vying for money and power. Candace gets a call from Bill Farrar at the National Cancer Institute because he is seeing symptoms in AIDS patients. So they're doing these studies and they're seeing symptoms of dementia in the brain, like in AIDS patients. So what they're figuring out is that AIDS is infecting the brain. And so he knew that Candace had done a bunch of work showing that the brain was connected to the body. And he said, maybe AIDS is able to, to pierce the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. Maybe we could, so they start collaborating. And Candace comes up, based on her sort of receptor technology, she comes up with a solution, Peptide T, that is basically, she creates a mimetic of the disease that will lodge inside that receptor and block the disease from taking its place. So then suddenly the disease doesn't have anywhere else to go.
So it doesn't spread.
And if you can't lock in, then the disease can't survive. It needs to lock into a receptor to survive. So that was the theory behind it. And at first there was, so then it becomes this very long process and drawn out process about how, in part Candace sabotaged herself. In part, she was legitimately sabotaged and undermined by people who really put their own interests, at heart. And I said this to you before, but I interviewed many scientists who were at the NIH and her colleagues at academic institutions who are now old enough that they basically said, you know what, I don't have anything to lose anymore. I'm just going to tell you the truth. And these are stories that really made me, while I was doing this research going through COVID, really distrust the medical establishment and really question the motives of people who should, be putting the Hippocratic Oath first. But in fact, not everybody seems to be putting themselves first and their ability to profit first. I mean, this is the AIDS, what Candace went through during the AIDS crisis is just emblematic of a much wider cancer that is spread throughout our medical establishment. Yeah,
and we could talk about that in COVID and that vaccine development and other things that, even how our government didn't. And I understand, why they were trying to, create some sort of order and have some sort of a roadmap. But I had just recently heard that Anthony Fauci was being interviewed and someone said, so where'd you come up with 6 feet? Having people be distant 6 feet. They just kind of picked 6 feet. Yep, 6 feet. Yeah. So anyway, we could go off piste on that for a while, but it is interesting. We talked about the 70s, we talked about the 80s, and you're seeing this kind of pattern of how drugs get developed and what happens in our country.
And by the 90s, Candace's opiate receptor discovery had been exploited to the extent by, pharmaceutical companies who were largely, controlling the study, the underlying data. So basically, academic institutions, what she saw happening which is, a widespread practice. There's an incredible book that was one of my sources, John Abramson's. It's called Sickening. And it's sort of, I can't remember what the subtitle is, but it's sort of like how, what's wrong with American healthcare and how to fix it. I mean, he talks about, he's testified many times to the FDA and other places, and he talks about this story, and I, substantiated it and verified it elsewhere, that during that time, pharmaceutical companies were, because they were funding studies done at academic institutions, they were the ultimate controllers of the data. So then suddenly they instead of doing it at the academic institutions, they started doing performing the experiments at what's called CROs, something research organizations, right? They basically own the lab. So they own the lab. They have the scientists who do the data, and then they hand off a subset of that data, a subset of that data that reflects very well on them and tells the story that they want, to an academic institution. In many instances, the academics did not know that they weren't receiving the full set of data. So they would write reports that they thought were true, that were basically functioning as marketing brochures for pharmaceutical companies. So, and then practicing doctors, you have your sort of doctors who are reading academic journals with the imprimatur of top academic institutions, thinking that they are getting unbiased reports, when in fact they're reading marketing brochures for pharmaceutical companies.
And it's the same thing happening with the FDA?
Yeah. I mean, the FDA,
you would
FDA
assume.
Interestingly, the FDA has access to the total data set. The FDA had access to OxyContin's at the absolute data set. They knew that the claims being made that it's a slow release, not addictive, and all this stuff, if anybody had done their homework, the FDA, so academic institutions don't get access to that data, the FDA does. So the FDA is even more to blame because, like for the opioid crisis, because they had the information, they just didn't look at it.
So what's their motivation? Is it lobbyists? And why would they not want to?
That part is not clear to me, whether it was laziness or just incompetence, or whether there was something more nefarious afoot. How they could let the creators of OxyContin go forward with claims that were absolutely fallacious. It's unclear to me how that happened.
So Candace is at NIH, right? Mm-hmm. She's watching her research be applied into a positive thing, right? With the AIDS drugs, and then she's coming out of that. She's now in the 90s. Does she feel vindicated that her research on mind-body connection is being substantiated or supported, or is it's out there, but it's just not being attributed to her? Here's where the story jumps the shark yet again. It's like, no, Candace went rogue. So the Dallas Buyers Club script is wrong. The Matthew McConaughey character, Ron Woodruff, before he was getting that drug, Peptide T, from a cheaper source in Mexico, he was getting it directly from the source. Candace became like Breaking Bad. She was working as chief of brain biochemistry at the NIH, but she was being legitimately sabotaged and undermined by colleagues there who were working with pharmaceutical companies who were seeking profit in many cases, and were trying to invalidate her research, who were really trying to sort of squelch her. And there was a lot of, again, I can go into the specifics, I do in the book, of, this old boys club stuff that she called baloney, going on. And there were a lot of, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And she was an outsider, and she was a woman. And she had already sort of distinguished herself as a firebrand. But when no one would listen to her, what she ended up doing as a federal government employee was she, before Tony Fauci in a legitimate way cultivated relationships with AIDS activists and ACT UP and the Provincetown Positives, Candace went rogue. She started developing relationships with activists and distributing her drug, not FDA approved. There were enough studies that had shown that it wasn't going to do any harm. So she knew she wasn't going to hurt anybody. This was actually sort of a natural, it was based on a natural chemical. But she wanted to get their support because they were increasingly powerful, with all of their rallies and lobbying the government. And she also wanted anecdotal support. She wanted to sort of use this to gather data about whether it was working and then have them lobby the government on her behalf. And so she was found out, and she and her husband, Michael Ruff, were kicked out of the NIH, in fact. This is her second husband? This is her second husband,
actually. And her partner, because the NIH found out. And they basically said, and he admitted this to me, they said, well, we could do this the nice way or the not so nice way. They allowed her to keep her pension if she left quietly. Of course, what I realized was none of this was in her memoir. You know, part of my desire to sort of tell her story is to tell the true story, because in her memoir, she had told the story that suited her. And what I was finding...
Molecules of Emotion is her memoir.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she sort of left that part out.
She left out a lot of stuff.
That? Did she say that she just left NIH and then she went on to
She did
be a
have
speaker
a financial sponsor. So there were a number of people. So there were all of these sort of contradictory, and this is not uncommon in science, that, you know, that certain experiments are unable, they said failure to replicate. It's like the nail in the coffin. But really, if you look at like every sort of big scientific advancement, you know, experiments are, you know, people fail to replicate them all the time because they do it a little differently, because, you know, and then over time, enough people do them and they get repeated, and then, you know, something becomes like scientific truth. So it's part of the scientific, you know, method for this to, but this was a very, it was like 5-alarm chili. This was like a very high stakes time in science where the spotlight was once again on Candace, but also on these leaders at the NIH, because after years of failing to sort of rein in AIDS or help in any way, the government was really watching, and a lot of people with money and power were watching. So this was an extreme time. It just did the same thing with the opiates. It was an extreme high intensity time. And Candace did something that was crazy. You know, she was arming, you know, working with activists, but then she finally, there was Elaine Kinney Thomas at Oncogen, you know, based in Seattle, had sort of, you know, replicated her results, and she had enough people in serious and significant positions that she was able to raise funding. She got a Pittsburgh industrialist and some of his biotech investors. And so the story that she tells in Molecules of Emotion is really one of like, I told you so. You know, she was like, oh, okay, I'm being squashed at the NIH. I'm going to waltz into the sunset in my limo and champagne with these fabulous, you know, investors and funders who really know the truth, and the truth is mine. And the reality is, Peptide T, we still don't know. Because, I mean, this is part of what happened as she personally, and she had bipolar disorder. So, and I don't lead with that, because I feel like I didn't want people to write her off as crazy. But she did do a lot of things that sabotaged and undermined herself. And yet many geniuses throughout history have been, you know, what they call it, touched by fire, you know, as, you know. And so Candace, her life began to unravel then. And so part of what what she talks about in her memoir is not actually representative of the truth. You know, the way she ends her memoir is on this very hopeful note, because saying that Peptide T had once again gotten funding, and they were waiting to see, you know, what happened in the world, and that she was hoping that she had contributed something that could really help and save people. What ended up happening is that's partially true, but also partially untrue, because there's a real tragedy to Candace's story as well.
So what happened there at the end? I mean, when you talk about, she writes this memoir. She's now is she speaking, doing speaking engagements, and
so Candace ended up becoming, because she wasn't getting the respect and admiration that she desired within the mainstream scientific community, or at least not as quickly as she would have wanted. You know, I mean, I think if she had done what Katalin Kariko did, which is just sort of put her head down and accept her fate. And this is part of the larger conversation about, like, what do we as women have to do to actually get what is due to us, you know, and recognized, you know.
But did she, by pushing back, you know, whether it was known or not, kind of, you know, make it possible for female scientists after her to push back?
100% she did. I mean, and she cites Rosalind Franklin, who Jennifer Doudna talks about in Codebreaker. You know, I mean, this is a touchstone for women, because Rosalind Franklin's work to identify a key part of DNA was stolen by Francis Crick and Watson Crick, and that enabled them to win the Nobel Prize. And part of what Candace said is, no way, I'm not going to be another Rosalind Franklin. And, you know, subsequently, that story is told, that story is used as sort of a jumping off point. And, you know, and Candace's was by women, you know, many women afterward.
Well, her story, I mean, thanks to you, is being told. And thanks to you, is really getting out there. I mean, the reviews for the book are tremendous. Incredible review from the Wall Street Journal. I saw Steven Soderbergh wrote something about you on his blog. I mean, how does that feel, seeing your work? And you talked about living with her for these past 6 years, seeing it get that kind of recognition. And I think because not only is it just, I think, so surprising that someone who's made such an impact is not a household name, but I think thanks to you, she will be. But it's also a story that I think resonates also with, I guess, many people with their careers, but particularly women. I mean, how she didn't get the acknowledgement that she deserved at different times in her career.
Yeah. She emulated the behavior of the dominant male in many situations. And the dominant males of her generation all went on, despite backstabbing and lying and cheating and all this stuff, to continue to have absolutely phenomenal careers. And one of the things I say is, yeah, she did some really bad stuff, but a lot of what she was doing was actually the cultural norm. You know, she was seeing that behavior all over the place. And so what happens when women or people of color or people who aren't part of the dominant group then adopt those behaviors because they have to succeed? But then essentially you do the thing that you're not supposed to do, that everybody else is getting away with, and you're burned at the stake.
Right.
And so part of what I'm using her story as like a launch pad to discuss like wider issues of like what turns a good person bad. You know, what are these, and this goes back to Stiletto Network. What are the systems that we devise that actually provide incentives for people to be good or for people to sort of go sideways, you know, and how do we fix some of those systems? You know, if you look at Candace's story, I mean, she ended up with her husband defrauding investors. I mean, and in the end, it was people who did not have money to give. There was a woman who remortgaged her house for $250,000 and is basically destitute as a result. Candace and Michael did this knowingly. They cheated people. They lied to the FDA. They lied to the Whitman Walker Clinic. They committed federal crimes. And so, and they've never been, I mean, Candace has died, but her husband has not been punished for any of this. And this is what's so interesting. He just received 3 grants.
This is like an Elizabeth Holmes story.
Oh, it most certainly is. It is exactly an Elizabeth Holmes story. Except for Candace seems to have more heart and soul, I want to believe. I mean...
Well, actually, she has this legacy of where she's made an incredible impact prior to that.
She did all these amazing things, but in the end, it went so sour that it was devastating. And Michael Ruff, based on a patent that Candace filed, that may be illegal, by the way, right before she died, has now received $6 million in new grants from 3 separate NIH agencies, despite being a criminal.
Wow.
Yeah. And he's out there. And this is taxpayer money. $6 million of taxpayer money has gone to him to make him more money to fund his research. That basically he's doing after Candace died. It was based on, but it was all her work. It was her patent, and he got it when she died after cutting her kids. After cutting her kids out of the will.
I mean, I think there's a sequel to this book, which is what happened.
It's so dirty. I never thought this story. I thought I was telling a story of like a female trailblazer, like a hidden figure. I never thought that I would become a crime reporter, but that's what's happened.
I love it. Well, that's my next question is, what is next for this book, but what is next for you? What's your next project? I mean, I know that the next thing for you is not going to be just one thing, because you have so many talents and so many different passions, and you've got so many projects in the works. But what do you think is next for this book or this story?
It's back to 2015, but with a different piece of intellectual property. You know, instead of creating a project based on Candace's book, I am working to create a film or a limited series. I mean, that's been the hope since day one. It was certainly an unexpected and, like I said, circuitous path to get here. But what I would really love, I mean, Candace is such a dramatic figure. It's such an incredible part for an actress to play. I would love to see this on screen. I mean, that's the hope. I have other irons in the fire, but this is by far my passion project. I love her. I love this character. I love the very meaty issues that it raises, and I'm not done.
Well, I was going to say, I can't wait to see it, and I know that's going to be the second Emmy on your bookshelf for sure. No, I'm serious.
It's been a long road.
It's such a fascinating story. And it, as you said, it touches upon so many different themes and issues that are happening within our society and other cautionary tales. But what an incredible story. And you tell it in such an incredible, thoughtful and beautiful way. So
thank you.
I can't wait to see what's next.
I got a lot of help. And I have to say, like, I'm so grateful to Candace's family. I'm very close to her kids, to her cousin, her sister. There were a lot of people who opened doors. I mean, similar to Stiletto Network.
Yeah.
Like I worked really, really hard, but the number of scientists who spent so many hours with me, working on this, I feel responsible not only to Candace, but to her family and also to the sort of the crowd that came together for this.
Oh, well, you are, her story is in great hands with you for sure.
Thank you.
But Pam, I'm just so happy to see you. I'm so excited about this incredible book and this story, and I can't wait to see where it leads. But I really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you so much.
And taking the time to talk to us about it. And I can't wait for part 2. You mentioned you being a crime reporter. I want to hear, whatever's happening next. And I look forward to watching you and cheering you on in what comes next after this.
Thank you. And I'm so excited for your next adventure. This is wonderful.
Thank you. Well, I'm so happy to see you. So thanks so much. That brings us to the end of this episode of The Interview. A big thank you again to Pamela Ryckman for joining us. And as always, thank you again for listening. If you enjoy the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Instagram at The Interview with Leslie Heaney. A new podcast is released every Wednesday. Until then, this is Leslie, and don't forget to join The Interview.